comes out of the affirmation that was our opening statement. I place myself and all that concerns me lovingly in the hands of the Father. Have you ever used that expression? Have you ever used those words? This goes back a long way, early 80s. In fact, it probably was 83, 84. There was a lady who used to call me a lot. She only came to church maybe 2-3 times, but she would call me on the phone almost daily. And I remember when I was living in Lee Summit at the Villa, she called me one evening at home, and she was having difficulty with a particular concept. She needed to put something lovingly in God's hands, get her hands off of it, and turn it over to God. So I told her about this, and she had a little difficulty kind of grasping the concept. So I said, well, do you make baked potatoes? She said, oh yes, I love baked potatoes. I said, well, when you take it out of the oven, you know how hot it is. You have to leave it cool for a moment. Leave it in God's hands. Let God take care of it until it's ready. I said, does that make sense to you? Oh yes. I said, well, I want you to do that with this whole situation. So I got a call later, I guess the next day, and she said, Greg, I did what you told me. I said, yes. And what happened? She said, well, I was hungry, so I ate it. And I think that is very much as I know probably many of us have been over the years. I once said, when it came to turning my life and my will over to a higher power as I understood it, oh, I would do that, but I'd have a little piece of monofilament fishing line. You could barely see it, but it was attached to it so that I could pull it back in case God didn't do it right. This affirmation is based upon Evelyn Whittle, W-H-I-T-E-L-L, Whittle, book, Lovingly in the Hands of the Father. You may not have seen it. It's an old Unity book. It's long out of print, but it's one of those precious old-time Unity books. And it is her concept of placing things lovingly in the hands of the Father. So our affirmation for this morning is based upon one of hers. Sometimes when we put something in God's hands, how quickly do we take it back? It's hard to let go. Constantly maybe thinking about it, checking to see what God's doing with it. Reminds me when I was in 4th grade. As a grade school teacher, have you ever had them plant things in your classroom? Well, my 4th grade teacher had us do that, and I remember I did a big cardboard box with lots of dirt in it. And, of course, what did Billy plant? Corn. Think about that. In a cardboard box in the classroom. Corn. But Billy was very much like the older Greg. My father's name was Gregory. My first name is Greg. So my middle name is William, named after my father's father. And they called me Bill or Billy when I was a kid. I don't take too kindly to it these days. Anyway, I found that I would periodically go scratch in the dirt to see what the corn was doing. Was it doing what it was supposed to do? Was it growing? Checking up on God, what do you think? When I ride with somebody in an automobile, I'm one of the worst passengers because I have probably a terminal case of backseat driver. Holding on in the turns and pushing on the brake on the floor. It's very difficult for me to relax and let it go and leave it in somebody else's hands. Just imagine how difficult it can be for us to place something lovingly in God's hands and leave it there. Like the hot potato when you take it out of the oven, you don't want to be juggling it. I've pulled them out of the microwave and tossing it in the air to try to get across the room to the plate. Sometimes you have to do whatever you can to let it go, let it be. To place something lovingly in the Father's hands is a form of prayer. Now, some of you may have heard of Glenn Clark. Glenn Clark wrote several booklets. One was on the Lord's Prayer. And in that book on the Lord's Prayer, he said that to have a wrong idea of God will ruin any prayer before it begins. That it affects your faith and your ability to trust. Wow. Before you first put something lovingly in the hands of the Father, you need to know what kind of hands you're putting it into. You need to have a solid concept of the reality of God. God is something that is not only infinite, but present within you, around you, but throughout the universe. And it's necessary to have a concept, an idea of God that you can trust in. A concept of who or what is worth trusting. I think it's important to think of the hands into which we are putting whatever concerns us. And I think most of the time, if we were to place something lovingly in the Father's hands, it's going to be something that's pretty important, don't you think? So it's good to realize what kind of hands those are. I was shown one of the magazine sections from the newspaper this morning. Thank you for doing that. That fits perfectly. And the title on the front page was Awe. A-W-E, awe. Sometimes I think awe is a good word because it describes what we should feel when we finally recognize that power into whose hands we're putting something. In my lifetime, there have been so many opportunities to sense awe. I remember one of them, when I was on the road as a musician and we would drive out west to Las Vegas. I remember coming down out of the mountains after the Hoover Dam, breaking out of the mountains, and all of a sudden there's the valley in front of you. And at night, not only is there the valley glowing with this radiant light, but above, the heavens open up when you get out of the hills, and all of a sudden you're looking up, and what's right over your head is 500,000 stars, all twinkling just for you in the pitch black of night. Sometimes we would arrive at 3 a.m. or something like that. What a sight. Absolutely amazing. There have been other times where I've had that sense of awe. I told you about it in Reno, when the guys in the band wanted to go fishing for trout in the Truckee River, and some guy came along, said he was a mechanic, like Charles Bronson, and that he had just thrown somebody in the Truckee River the day before. Oh. And then Tony, our drummer, came over to me and said, "Greg, he doesn't like you." Oh, That's nice. We had built a fire and we were cooking hot dogs, and Tony said, Greg, we got to get out of here. He's got a gun. Okay, Tony, relax. I need to go over and put the fire out. Greg, we got to put the fire. I walked over towards the fire, and I heard scurry, scurry, scurry. And when I kind of glanced to the side, I saw this person following, and the gun was like this. I went to the fire. I put the fire out very calmly, slowly walked back to my car. Tony's saying, Greg, hurry! Very slowly, I got in the car. We drove up out of there. Nothing happened. When I got up from the riverbed up onto the highway, the absolute awe hit me. Wow. And it's as if, oh my God, in that moment I realized what had happened and how I had been, as far as I was concerned, divinely protected. It was an amazing moment, realizing that I was calm and I did everything slowly because that's what I had to do, to not excite the person, to not trigger something, so pardon the expression. Many times in my life, I've had that moment of absolute awe. One Sunday back in, I think it was 1985, I was living at the villa, which did not allow pets. And one January night when it was 5 below, my folks were leaving, and as they went out the door, this cat ran into my apartment. She became my friend Myrtle, who was with me until she was 20 years old. No pets. But then Myrtle ended up being great with child. Or children, I suppose. And one Sunday, as I went to bed Sunday evening after a nice morning at church, next to my bed was a closet. And in that closet was a large, tall toolbox. And there was a compartment down in the bottom that was open. And from the closet, as I was trying to go to sleep, I heard, seems like with each contraction, she was purring through the whole process, and with each contraction, there was this little bit of hiccup. So I got up, turned on the light, and I watched 6 kittens being born. Of course, I coached, okay, cleansing breaths. Looked like everything was done. I went back to bed, turned the light out. Okay, light back on. There was one more. Number 7. Now understand, Myrtle had 6 place settings and 7 kittens. That one I ended up calling Charlie. He was the runt of the litter. And of course, everybody was pushing him off so he couldn't eat. And I thought I was going to try to make formula and whatever, and I'd pull him off, and I'd pull one of the others off and stick him on, and then they'd push him away. It was a struggle, but Charlie ended up being a big, glorious Maine Coon. You know what they look like, yeah? Big, bushy tail, little tufts of fur in their ears and between their toes, and he was striped charcoal, absolutely exquisite. He grew up well, and I kept Charlie. So I had Chuck and Myrtle and Charles. It's pretty interesting. That night, watching her give birth to all of those kids, it was another moment of awe. She absolutely trusted that power. I wasn't sure. Did she know how to do this? It was all very much in God's hands. And it was a perfect perfect delivery. She didn't need any instruction from me, even though I was giving instructions. Oh, yes. Oh, now you need. I know she was laying there going, oh, God, will he ever shut up? God and I know how to do this. That's one of the big ahas in my life is God knows how. And God knows far more about it than we do. So you don't have to, when you place something in God's hands, then tell God how to do it. Your job is to leave it there. That's the challenge. Think of those hands. Those infinite hands that can do all things, be all things, express all good. You have to think about those hands before you can trust something to them. You have to think about them after you start trusting them to realize it's still in God's hands and God is holding on, taking care of it. You have to trust them. And you think of those hands as a means of trusting them. The more I think that we learn about prayer, and the more successful we become in prayer, the more we realize it's not about the asking. It's not about what the issue is you're praying about. The important piece is the communion with God, the connection, that common union, that sense of oneness. And when you've had that sense of connection with God, connection with 500 million stars right over your head, connection with what sets the universe in motion and keeps it functioning perfectly without your intervention. Wow. But let Myrtle know she was in good hands giving birth to those 7 kids. Oh, they were gorgeous. They all survived. And that same power made it possible for me to live in the villa, which allowed no pets, with a mom and 7 kittens. For months. And it even reached the place where the manager would call and say, Greg, the exterminator's coming tomorrow. So I could put them away where nobody would see them, like stuff them in my bedroom. Because he only did the bathroom and the kitchen, It worked. Because as long as I lived there, after I gave the 6 kids away, and I kept Charlie and I had Myrtle in my apartment as long as I lived there. If God can do that, just imagine what it can do in your life. That connection, that communion. You contemplate what is visible of the power of God in your life. Think about it. It's a great reminder that those hands know how to take care of whatever concerns you. Those hands will hold it in love. Those hands will hold you in love. There's a scripture passage from Jeremiah that, as I was thinking about this, came right to mind. The potter and the clay, and it's a wonderful idiom. This is from the 18th chapter of Jeremiah, beginning with the first verse. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will let you hear my words. So I went down to the potter's house. Well, God bless Jeremiah. He pays attention to guidance. Do we? Oh, well, maybe later. I have to go to the grocery first. Well, I'm watching this television show, Lord. now. Do it now. He went down to the potter's house, and there he was working at his wheel. And the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand. And he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do. Interesting. The human potter made a mistake. But he corrected the mistake. You get a redo with clay, don't you? That would start all over again. I played with a pottery wheel once. I'm not going to say I actually used one. I played with one. Man, that was tough. Then the word of the Lord came to me. May this word come to you. O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, says the Lord? Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. What you place in God's hands, God can form and shape, reform and reshape. But if you put something in the potter's hand, you have to leave it there if he's going to create a vessel for you. If he's going to create just the thing you want. If you keep pulling the clay back, you're going to end up with a lump of clay. What you give to the potter, you leave to the potter. God can take the clay of your life and form it and shape it. And not for what you think is good for you, but what is for your highest good. I remember years ago, there was a man here in the church. He's passed now, but I remember he once said to me, he said, "Boy, I've had some challenges with a couple of people." And he said, "You know, I learned, put them in God's hands and pray for their highest good." He said, "Boy, when their highest good hits them, you never know what's going to happen." And that's true. Your highest good is always going to be for the best, not just what you can conceive of in this moment. So, think of that potter and that clay in his hands. You put the clay of your life, the clay of your concerns in the potter's hands, and you let the potter do what he is skilled to do, to create with those two hands, to form and shape a vessel that holds the good, far better good than you could possibly conceive. I know it's difficult to leave it with God because we have problems with trusting. In our lives, people have failed us. If you can't trust people whom you can see, how can you possibly trust a power and a presence and an intelligence that you can't see? But you can see, not with visual sight, but with insight. When you look at those seemingly impossible situations that you've already lived through in your life, when some power made something great happen, when you were divinely protected. Sue and I experienced one of those Christmas 2 years ago. We were going out to Bishop Williams' house for Christmas and New Year's. After the candlelighting service and packing afterwards. I was up all night, and I was up something like 24 hours before we hit on a plane and flew to Phoenix, and then from Phoenix to Santa Barbara, and then picked up a rental car, and I had 25 miles to drive from Santa Barbara to Ojai, and we were in traffic jam, crawling on the highway. And I kept having these little momentary blackouts in the traffic. Got off the highway and headed to the road inland to Ojai. It was just a few miles, maybe 12 miles more, and the speed was about 60. And all of a sudden, I heard this horrible racket of things under the car. I opened my eyes, and we were off the road. In the one portion of that road where there were no trees, no poles, only tall grass. And man, this rental car was a lawnmower, cutting through that high grass. And I just whipped back onto the road. Fortunately, of course, but it was in God's hands because there was nobody coming. And boy, then I was awake. Yeah. Somebody else was driving that car that day. It wasn't me. You have things like this happen in your life. Remember them. Feel that sense of awe, that sense of connection, that sense of oneness. Realize those hands are open to you always. What do you have? What are you concerned about? What are you afraid of? Put it in God's hands. And then trust. Trust that power that has been in your life all this time, that's rescued you numerous times, that's made good happen when you saw no way. In God's hands, there is always a way, where to our human sense, there appears to be no way. So begin to think. What would you put in God's hands? You can visualize yourself placing it, whatever concerns you, there, and know that once you put it there, it is in the finest pair of hands in the entire universe. The most powerful, intelligent pair of hands in the universe. And you can leave it there knowing that God will only bring about what is for your highest good. So begin to think what you would put in God's hands. And remember our affirmation that you place yourself in all that concerns you lovingly in the Father's hands, and know that your highest good comes to you. Let us join in speaking these words together. I place myself and all that concerns me lovingly in the hands of the Father, and know that my highest good comes to me.